For 2 years, Sandra Luz Hernandez skirted an abyss of violence and impunity that threatened to swallow her up at every turn. But she refused to back down. "I'm going to be a rock in his shoe," she declared of the prosecutor in charge of investigating the forced disappearance of her son, Edgar. On February 12, 2012, a group of armed masked men stormed into his house in Culiacán, Sinaloa, and carried him away. He was never seen again. It was a typical levantón, literally a taking, where unknown men forcibly carry someone off, usually to a safe house or some remote location, sometimes for torture and interrogation, sometimes for ransom, sometimes for execution, and often for some combination of these and other torments. The perpetrators include organized crime, the police, and the military, often cooperating with one another. The victims are often set free and sometimes killed, sometimes celebrated and sometimes denied, sometimes dumped in public spaces, and sometimes forcibly disappeared. The constant is an armed commando taking and holding a person or group of people against their will, exercising near complete power over their bodies for a period of time, and then leaving them and their family and friends with very little means of explaining what happened, why, or who is responsible. In addition to the methodology of the levantón and the spectrum of suffering it inflicts, the common thread in these stories is the nebulous and volatile nature of power that the levantón represents. The use of terror and intimidation tactics by a broad mix of government and criminal actors, the uncertainty about who wields the power to carry out these acts and to what ends, and the failure of the formal apparatus of the state to protect people from the harm they cause, or even to acknowledge it, threaten more than just the bodily integrity of ordinary citizens. Their feeling of moral agency and the coherence of their communities are at stake. Levantones make people question whether their lives really matter and to whom. And that is from The Taken, True Stories of the Sinaloa Drug War by Javier Valdez Cárdenas. I'm Melissa Ford, and this is Hard Country.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joshua Treviño with my colleague, Melissa Ford. This is The Hard Country. Welcome, Melissa. A chilling and fascinating excerpt. How did you find that? Is this a book worth reading?
Yes. So the reason that I picked it is because I found it very interesting. It's a collection of first-hand accounts from ordinary people, specifically in Sinaloa, who have experienced these levantones that the passage talks about, or that live in constant fear of it happening to them. And so I just thought that it was interesting because today one of our main topics of conversation will be violence and disappearances in Mexico. So I found it relevant.
Yeah.
But I know that we will go into that a little bit later in this episode.
Okay. Whenever you like, actually. It's one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the violence that's encompassing Mexico right now is this phenomenon of the desaparecidos. So I hadn't heard the term levantones before. It's literally the taken ones, right?
Yeah,
yes.
It's a modern term, unfortunately. And it's unfortunate that we have to have a term for it. But yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing that. It'll get a little bit sad. We've been sent some recent articles of this happening in Mexico and the government's response to that. And I think it's definitely important to touch on. But to start off the episode, I want to start off with something a little bit more newsworthy. As you know, the GOP presidential debate, candidate debate happened last Wednesday in Milwaukee.
That's right.
And here there was a discussion that the Republican candidates had about the use of military force in Mexico.
Yes.
And I want to give you like a couple of different things that were said, and then I want to get your reaction.
Please, go ahead.
So on one side, there was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who, when asked, he didn't hesitate to promise that he would send the U.S. military into Mexico to fight the cartels on day one if he becomes the next president of the United States. He said, "The cartels are killing tens of thousands of our fellow citizens. We have to reestablish the rule of law, and we have to defend our people. The president of the United States has got to use all available powers as commander-in-chief to protect our country." So that's one reaction. The second one is from former Vice President Mike Pence. And he actually supported partnering with the Mexican army to hunt down and destroy the cartels.
Yes.
And another person who still thinks that we should try to work with Mexico on this was actually former Arkansas governor Asa Hutchinson.
Yeah.
And he said that he would support limited military action, such as intelligence gathering against the cartels, but only if Mexico could be looped into that effort. He said that cooperation makes a difference, and we cannot be successful going against the cartels unless we bring in Mexico as our partner.
Right. Right. Well, there's a lot there, if I may.
Yes.
And obviously with the proviso, which I feel like I have to issue right off the bat, that the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which produces this podcast, is a 501c3 nonprofit.
Right.
So we don't endorse campaigns or candidacies nor involve ourselves in them, but we do talk about policy ideas. So in that spirit, I'll talk about the policy ideas that are behind a lot of these. It's good, at least, let's start with the positive. It's good that there's a general recognition among office seekers within the conservative movement, within those who are, engaged in the civic space in the United States, that there needs to be new thinking and certainly more aggressive action vis-a-vis what's happening in Mexico. I wish it were possible to proceed on a basis of full cooperation with the Mexican state. That used to be the basis on which we proceeded, and it was always imperfect because corruption has always been an issue within the organs of the Mexican state. But there was a time that was not too long ago, really until Felipe Calderón left office in December 2012. When you could plausibly and I think rationally and defensively, look at something like a Plan Colombia model for Mexico. Now, Plan Colombia, for those of our listeners who don't know, was this long unspooling, almost a generational effort.
Yeah. And
partnership between Colombia and the United States that really had at its core the reassertion of sovereignty. It wasn't really. It gets tagged, I think, incorrectly as an anti-drug effort, and that context provided a lot of its proximate cause and inspiration. But fundamentally, what it was about was restoring the Colombian state to full sovereignty over Colombia, which was not just the operational aim, but the strategic aim for us and for the Colombian state itself.
Yeah.
And you could proceed. There was an effort with the Merida partnership to proceed along the same basis with Mexico, starting in basically the second half of the first decade of this century. That requires, though, a state that actually does want to be sovereign over its own territory. It requires a state that is not in league with the forces that are pushing it back. In Colombia, you mostly had those conditions pertain, but in Mexico, unfortunately, and this has been true, I would argue, at the top level since Enrique Peña Nieto took office in December 2012. That just hasn't been true with the Mexican state. That there's been this kind of this spiral of deepening cooperation between the state and its criminal syndicates, to the point where the argument that we're making now in the year 2023 is that it's almost impossible to disentangle them. So it would be nice if we lived in the world that Asa Hutchinson would like, in which we have partnerships and intel gathering. By the way, we used to have signal stations and intel gathering in Mexico itself. And that went by the wayside because under the PRI regime, the previous presidency, we got kicked out. And there was also at least one episode in which the Americans who were helping man these stations were attacked by either cartels or individuals in league with cartels. Same thing with the proposal that we work with the Mexican military. Yes, absolutely the ideal scenario. Again, local partner, respect for their sovereignty. They take the lead in exercising stewardship over their country. But again, you and I have talked about this on the show, Melissa. What is Sedena now? It is a trafficking organization unto itself.
Right.
You don't have an entity that goes to the mat to rescue General Cienfuegos from El Padrino from U.S. prosecution in 2020, 2021. That is in any way clean or a viable partner for the United States. So what are we left with? We're left with two of the candidates that I'm aware of, and there may be more out there, so I don't want to give any of them short shrift. But I know that former President Trump, actually when he was in office, and also Governor DeSantis now, that he's a candidate. Both of them have proposed a role for the United States Armed Forces versus Mexican loss of sovereignty, Mexican aggression, Mexican antagonism, so on. And my response is, let's have that conversation. It is time to change the basis on which we operate. And because the first obligation of the federal government and of every level of government in the United States is, stated in our founding documents, to secure our liberty, to preserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the right to those things, it ought to be defending us with every tool at its disposal. And that has to include the armed forces when a foreign actor is involved. So ask me anything you want, but we can go in depth on this, because I think this is the time to have this conversation.
No, I agree. I find it interesting. I think we talk about this a lot because we're in the weeds of policy.
Sure.
And you would understand for presidential candidates to know what's going on as well. But even regular people nowadays are starting to come to the realization that Mexico is not our friend and Mexico is not our partner. And I guess that's why, for me, it's kind of baffling to see people like mayors or people that live at the border still think that it is a reality within our grasp to work with Mexico, even when they're seeing the reality of what's happening at the border.
Yeah.
I saw that Victor Treviño, he's
Laredo.
the mayor of Laredo.
Yes, my fellow Treviño. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
your fellow Treviño.
Nice guy.
Yeah. I've heard, I think you've told me that before,
Yeah.
but he just said that we need to coordinate with Mexico to fight cartels. So,
Sure.
The same language that a lot of people are using. And so it's just kind of baffling for me, for someone at the border, the mayor of someone at the border that's seeing everything that's happening, to still think that that's a viable route.
I have to have some empathy with the folks here, especially at the border. And, I think we may have mentioned on one of our previous shows, Mayor Treviño in Laredo was very gracious in meeting with us 3 weeks ago, I guess it was, which is a million years in the past at this point. In full candor, and this won't be a surprise to him, that would be a point at which I disagree with him. But I think out of charity, we have to, put ourselves into the shoes of an individual who is a mayor or an alcalde of a border community, which in the case of Laredo is the largest inland port.
Right.
I think it might have challenged for largest port period in the United States. And so this idea that you would develop an antagonistic relationship, from a commercial standpoint with your counterparts across the river seems less plausible. Now, our role at the foundation, I think as citizens writ large, is to kind of take the larger view and just say, what's best for the state of Texas and what's best for the United States in general. And so we have our preferences. I'm not going to cast stones at anybody who holds a contrary view, but what I am going to do is argue very strenuously that we need to proceed on a basis of realism. On that point, there's an article I would commend to our listeners today by Rich Lowry, who is, I believe he's the editor, senior editor at National Review, also writes for Politico, and so is one of their senior columnists. And you kind of have to look past the headline on the piece, because the headline is abominable. But I can speak from experience. It's the guy who writes the piece and the guy who picks the headline are often two different people. So you don't always get the headline that you want.
True.
The headline is kind of a knock on Governor DeSantis, which I think is unwarranted in this case. But the piece is quite interesting. I don't think Lowry is necessarily where I am, or maybe where you are on the issue of U.S. armed forces versus the Mexicans.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a very good piece, well written, and very realistic in terms of setting forth kind of the stakes, and at the close of it, acknowledging that the reason that we're having this conversation is not actually because of a lot of what you see blamed from AMLO or from the left, that it's demagoguery or that there's just a desire to demonize Mexico. None of that's really in evidence. What's really happening is that there are people who are looking at things through the lens of realism. They're seeing and understanding what's happening on the Mexican side, and it's completely true. For those, I don't want to impute any views to Lowry on this, but I think what he was saying is that those who have views on either side of it, particularly those who are opposed to the use of armed force vis-a-vis the Mexican state, need to start making a realism-based case, because the status quo, partnership, let's continue on doing what we're doing, let's keep on investing in building up whatever it is, Sedena, local police forces in Mexico, all these things that have just failed completely over the past generation. There has to be an alternative presented. We are presenting an alternative because we do think that there needs to be a much more aggressive stance toward the Mexican state and accountability imposed upon them, which is something you and I have talked about many, many times. But for those who don't agree with that, what I would say to them is make your proposal. What's your answer? What's this? What should you do? I'll say one more thing on Larry's piece. Larry does have a credible answer. I think it's an incomplete one in full candor, but it is nonetheless credible. In one of the cases that he makes in this piece, and we'll link all this in the show description, so you can read it for yourself. Is that there's a lot more that we could do. We could go back to Trump-style border closures, much more aggressive policing, all of which I actually agree with. I think all of that's correct. The argument that I would make is that I would say it's a yes and approach, not a no but. Like everything that he puts in that article, I think is true and things that we ought to do. But at the same time, there needs to be one step further in essentially compelling the Mexican state, either out of a sense of its own self-interest and stewardship toward its people, or out of fear of what the United States might do. I'm agnostic on their motivation, but the Mexican state must exercise full sovereignty over Mexico and Mexican territory and not share it with its own criminal cartels. And that's the end state that we need, because until we do that, any measures that we undertake on the north side of the border are going to be essentially holding back the tide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I think you sent me that article this morning. So to our listeners, please continue to read.
Yes.
Don't get deterred.
Yeah.
And I'll make sure to link it. Thank you, Josh. And since we're talking about what it would look like to take action at the border, I wanted to ask you about this very unusual scenario that just happened at the border, I believe this weekend.
Yes.
Where this Texas National Guard soldier apparently shot across the Rio Grande and wounded a Mexican man.
Yes.
What can you tell us about this scenario? Because I've read a couple different things on it.
This has been one of the most interesting examples of media failure.
Yeah.
In reporting that I've seen in a while. So for those who don't know, among our listeners, the Texas Army National Guard has been at the border as part of Operation Lone Star for quite some time.
Right.
It's been underway for a while. And there was an incident, I guess, 72 hours ago.
Yeah. It's pretty recent.
Maybe over the weekend, relatively recently.
I think it was Saturday night.
Oh, was it Saturday night?
If I'm not mistaken, I think so.
Okay. Outside of Juarez, outside of the Juarez El Paso conurbation. I don't know exactly where, but way out in West Texas, almost in New Mexico. And the very short version is that there was a guy in Mexico. It's not even clear to me that he was a Mexican national, but there was a guy in Mexico whose name was, implausibly enough, Darwin was his first name reported.
I didn't know that part.
Which is anyway. If you believe that's his name, so be it. But he's shot. He is shot. He's wounded. Thank God it's not dead. But he is shot by a Texas Army National Guardsman who was on the U.S. side.
Right.
So this came to my attention because the Texas Tribune, which is a very left-wing publication here in Austin, reported that the Texas National Guard had shot a Mexican guy who was doing, it was a very weird turn of phrase, doing sports. It's not something you would say in English. You would say it in Spanish, hacer deportes or something like that, but doing sports on the banks of the Rio Grande in the dark. And so it seemed odd. So it sent me on a little bit of a kind of a wild rabbit chase, because they said that they'd gotten the report as presented in kind of mainstream media, by which I mean left-wing media in the United States. But I repeat myself, is that you had this picture of an American soldier who shoots a guy in Mexico. How cruel and unprovoked is that? Unprovoked. And, this guy's just doing sports on the, I don't even know what that means.
Let the man do sports.
Doing sports on the banks of the Rio Grande and at night, which seems totally innocent. So the Tribune story listed this report in El Diario, which is, I guess, in the context of Mexican press, it's fine. I mean, the bar's low. So I clicked back through to El Diario, and look, as we've discussed, my Spanish is not ironclad, but I can read a newspaper article. And so the newspaper article said something completely different than what the secondhand report in Texas Tribune said. Texas Tribune, by the way, has since modified its story, so they're a little bit more accurate now.
Good. I hadn't seen that.
But we had to contact them to get them to do it. And what El Diario said was that the guy was actually in the river trying to cross illegally. And so he's crossing illegally. He gets shot. He goes back. He tells Mexican authorities. El Diario reported all this. He tells the authorities who were treating him that he was in the river trying to cross illegally. But then when he gets to the hospital and other media shows up, then he changes the story and says that he's just an innocent guy doing sports on the north bank of the river. So that phrase I can't say it enough. It just cracks me up. Doing sports, yes. And that's when his new story emerges, that he was doing sports on the South Bank, and some American soldier, some Texas National Guardsman, shot him for no reason. Strange. So here, we should exercise rational skepticism. I mean, not only was this guy clearly in the river, it sounds like he was trying to illegally cross for some reason. To me, that still didn't feel like we had the full story. And I ended up asking some contacts who are in. I actually don't have their permission to say who they are online, but they're adjacent to National Guard Bureau and regular Army. So a couple of guys I know. And they both said variations of the same thing. They said, it's always possible. You can never discount the possibility of negligent discharge or things like that. And it certainly isn't that your average soldier is 100% working. But it's very rare. It'd be extremely unusual to have a guy shoot across the river.
Right.
And so the thesis that was floated to me was that probably this guardsman saw the individual who ended up getting shot, and again, thank God wasn't killed, but ended up getting shot, was probably either pulling a firearm himself and threatening the guardsman or threatening somebody in the river. And that brings us to the information that we have seen kind of filtering out through a lot of alternative sources in the past 24 hours, which it turns out that, and again, treat this as unconfirmed, but you can sort of see how the story starts to kind of coalesce and resolve itself as we go, that this guy who was shot, far from being just, random, Joe Darwin or Jose Darwin on the south bank of the river doing sports, right? He apparently, treat this as unconfirmed, but again, you can see the pieces start to fall into place.
Right.
He apparently is in the river, crossing with a group. He is a trafficker, and he pulls a knife on somebody, threatens them, and at that point, gets shot. Which is part of a duty to protect. You have at this point when you replace the picture that U.S. press, U.S. media tried to paint of an innocent random Mexican who's shot by this villainous American soldier with what seems like actually happened, which is a human trafficker. And when you hear a human trafficker, think the word slave dealer in your head, because we're not talking about a moral difference between the two, who has a knife pulled on one of the people that he's trafficking.
Right, he was threatening them.
Threatening that individual. Then at that point, it becomes much more understandable how he might have gotten himself shot by a soldier from the American side. So we're not applauding the violence. It's incredibly regrettable that happens to anybody. But at the same time, if that is in fact the sequence of events, then thank God, in a literal sense, that soldier was there to save that life.
Yeah.
And that is the system working, and it's something that we've said time and time again that Texas and the agents of Texas DPS, Texas National Guard, Texas Rangers, the whole apparatus of the state of Texas that has been doing its best to secure the border while the federal government largely has failed to do so. And that's not a disparagement of the individual border patrolmen, by the way, most of whom are doing the best job they can under terrible restrictions. They've done more to save lives of migrants than anybody else has, simply by virtue of trying to control that border. I want to add one other thing on this. The level of demagoguery, misdirection, and misinformation that attaches itself to every border story is, and you've seen this firsthand, is absolutely through the roof. I know we're going to talk about the Buoys case in a second. That's been one example of it.
Great example.
You've had this rhetoric about people have been drowning in the buoys, and I can see like ripped clothing and things like that, which is none of which is true.
And
actually.
The recent story of how it's like. The razor wire is killing geese. Did you see that?
It's killing geese.
Yeah.
No, I hadn't heard that. Oh my gosh. Well then, I mean, won't you think of the geese, right?
Again, one more example.
The razor wire is killing people. I saw this video where it was, I think it was Julian Castro. It was Julian or Joaquin, one of the Castro brothers, Democratic left-wing mainstays out of San Antonio.
Yep.
And you watch his Twitter video, and he says, I can see shredded clothing right here and in the wire, and the implication is that people have just been like coming through and tearing their clothes on it, and their bodies are ripped to pieces. All of which is completely false, and nobody's gone through the buoy barriers at all like that, and it's likely just the normal trash that accumulates on the river, especially where there's habitation. The kind of the example of this to me was back when there was the Haitian migrant crisis outside of Del Rio, which was
Little Haiti. Yeah.
Right, exactly. When you had the 10,000 Haitians come and they congregated all at once,
yeah.
right? Which was an organized operation from the Mexican side.
Of course it was.
Yes, it was. I mean, we know this, right? Because of Todd Bensman's reporting, because he actually went into northern Mexico and found out that they'd all been released at the same time. So this is in September 2021, I think.
Yeah,
right?
I think so. Yeah.
And so that's when I went down there with several colleagues to see it. But you had, I don't know if you remember this actually, but do you remember the issue where the Mounted Border Patrol agents were supposedly whipping the Haitians? Yeah. So which they weren't doing at all, right? It was a guy on a horse and he had his reins, and so it was media that was unequipped to understand how you ride a horse and that you require reins of the horse. And so there was a photograph and the reins were kind of flying loose, and it was this idea that they were getting whipped. And so the president of the United States himself, in like this moment of comparative lucidity for him, said that these guys are going to suffer consequences, and it was it's going to be we're going to get them, and he threatened their career, and literally all they'd done is like ride their horses and try to get these people who were trying to enter the United States illegally. That is just the lie upon lie upon lie that attaches itself to almost every one of these border stories, and we have to understand it as we listen to the coverage and we watch the conversation around it. Those of us who are there and are trying to tell the truth about it need to know that there's this entire press apparatus out there. Unfortunately, it's just the reality, that is ready and willing to lie about it, to slant it as much as they can, and if they have so little attachment to the men and women who are trying to protect us and them, that they'll lie about them and slander them. They'll lie about Border Patrol agents and say that they're whipping Haitians. And just as we saw this week, they will promulgate lies about soldiers, Texas Army National Guardsmen, men who took an oath to defend their state and their country and community, including the members of our media, and say that they're shooting across the river unprovoked, trying to almost killing an innocent guy who's just doing sports. And that is, in any case, I've spoken too long, but that's something that strikes me as absolutely unconscionable, and I'm glad that we're here to be able to tell a little bit of the truth.
Clear it up a little bit.
Yeah.
What it reminds me of, I used to play this when I was little, but like a bad game of telephone where you just like pass the information on and it gets not only blown out of proportion, but it gets completely rewritten.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it reminds me of, not just this situation, but pretty much every single situation, as you said, that relates to the border.
Yeah.
And so since we're on that, I want to ask you a little bit since I've been gone, so you can fill me and the listeners up a little bit on what's happening with the buoy situation.
Oh my gosh. Well, the buoy situation, very interesting. So to recapitulate, Texas has put buoys in the river. We've already talked about it a little bit outside of Eagle Pass, and they're pretty effective, actually. So it's impossible to swim under them. They do seem to block crossing. And this has been it's been so interesting because for all the things that Texas has done, the insertion of these buoy barriers into the Rio Grande has generated more response from both the Mexican and federal side than any other single thing that the state of Texas has done.
Response and outrage. Response and outrage,
yes. And so we can theorize why. My theory is that there's some income stream being disrupted from the Mexican side. And so the Mexicans are raising hell over it. They know that they've got a direct line thanks to our ambassador, Ken Salazar, who's very close with the president of Mexico and basically speaks for him vis-a-vis the White House and kind of the State Department apparatus. They've got a line into the Biden administration in Washington, D.C. And so what we've seen as both Mexico and Washington, D.C. have moved against these buoy barriers, principally, but not entirely, within the judiciary, is that you've got Mexico City and Washington, D.C., these two national capitals, coming together to act against Texas. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It's very dangerous as well, and it's very overt as well. Those who have had the opportunity to read a lot of the arguments in court filings, the extent to which the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, has advocated on behalf of the Mexican state versus the state of Texas and the people of Texas,
says a lot.
People of the United States. It says a lot, and it's been extremely distressing to see the avidity and readiness with which Washington, D.C. has really elected to cooperate with a foreign power against one of the 50 American states, in this case, the state of Texas. And it should be an illuminating moment. There is an article in The Federalist by Greg Sindelar, our boss, CEO of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which again, we're going to link in the show description here, so you should go look at it. But it's in thefederalist.com. It went up yesterday, and it's Greg laying out what's really at stake in the litigation, the federal litigation against the border buoys outside Eagle Pass, Texas. And I think his point that he makes in there is very astute. It's very keen. It's not really about the buoys as such. It's not about the barriers as such. They're important. They matter. They should be defended. They should be present in the river because of the risk of human trafficking and illegal crossing and so on. But what's really at stake here is whether the federal government wishes to continue to do its duty to the people and states of the United States. And that is such a fundamental point. Washington, D.C., I think, is blind to the existential crisis that they're slowly creating with their actions on the border. It's been one thing, because it's been going on for years and years, for Washington, D.C. to fail to secure the border, kind of from a point of passivity. Like, they don't do what they ought to. They don't secure the border. Therefore, things happen. And I think from a kind of a large kind of citizenship/allegiance standpoint, that is stuff that is rationalizable. Because if it falls under the rubric of just generalized federal incompetence, which is a common story that everybody really understands and knows, doesn't necessarily strike at the bargain, the compact that exists between the citizen and government, then it's survivable. What's qualitatively different now is that we see the federal government taking positive actions to stop citizens, to stop states from defending themselves, in effect demanding that we submit to essentially our own political dissolution. It'd be something that that the founders would have found incomprehensible. One of the things that we've done at the foundation, because we've written extensively, we've got published research on this. I guess we should link this in the show description too. So, reader, you've got a lot of reading to do after you watch this. But we've talked about a state's Article 1, Section 10 obligations under invasion, right, under the Constitution. Like what constitutes invasion, what can a state do? And in the course of doing that research, it became clear that that the founders anticipated a lot in their genius, but one thing that they didn't really anticipate was not just federal refusal to do its job vis-a-vis just the securing the existence and the permanence of our political institutions and our political community, but actually becoming actively hostile to it, which is now kind of the line that the Biden regime has stepped over. It is incredibly dangerous and incredibly foolish for anybody. It's this particular administration that's done it, but for anybody in Washington, D.C. To say, you know what, we are going to actively militate against a state defending itself within constitutional bounds. We're actively going to suppress any effort by the citizenry to ensure the continuity of its own institutions and its own way of life and its own, again, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and to set itself at odds with and at enmity toward those imperatives. Really get into a situation where they raise existential questions that, in full candor, are so profound that I'm actually not going to explore them on this podcast because they deserve to be written about instead. But they need to know, and you should go read Greg Sindelar's article on The Federalist, because it sets it forth, very crisply and I think very properly qualified. That they need to understand that they are inviting on a crisis, and the crisis. Fundamentally it's not because migrants are coming across, although that's a huge phenomenon and problem. It's not even because drugs are coming across, although that's a phenomenon and a huge problem as well. It is fundamentally because the willingness on the federal side to force the rest of us to acquiesce to it is striking at the heart of what it means to be part of the United States. And thank God we have Texas to stand up and act in what I would describe as the actual American spirit and the actual constitutional spirit in that vein. But a lot of this is TBD.
They're complicit. It's not just like being blind anymore, I think. They're
complicit. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, that's exactly right. And what an awful impasse to be at when you see your own federal government that actively complicit in it.
Yeah.
If I can go on a speculative rant here for a second, which not for the first time, mind you, but we have to ask ourselves why this is. Some of it's ideological. There is an ideological resistance to the idea that states could actually possess sovereignty under the 10th Amendment. That grips, I think, modern progressivism, but definitely grips kind of the entirety of Washington, D.C. and those who are really embedded in the federal regime, in which, of course, President Biden is Exhibit A.
Yeah.
And so we have to be aware that there is that ideological component to it. But I think there's a pragmatic component to it as well. There's federal elections in both the United States and in Mexico, elections for the presidency next year, and you have to remember that both parties need something from the other. And it's the Mexicans who have always been the more aggressive negotiators on that side. And I would bet, I have no direct evidence for this. I want to be very, very clear to the listeners here that this is just speculation on my part, but I think it's informed speculation. I would bet that part of the reason the feds are coming down so hard in Texas right now is because the Mexican side has said, this is our price. You must do this for us in order to avoid, say, the migrant surge coming through in 2024 and screwing up your reelection.
Well, you say it's just speculation. I would say I agree. And I actually,
if we had press that did its job, they would be asking these questions.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, I apologize for interrupting, please.
No, thank you. I actually wasn't going to bring this up this episode. This was for a previous episode, I think the one last week. But it seems to me like you said, it seems to me like the Biden administration is tripping over themselves to try to get along with López Obrador and to try to get along with the Mexican government.
Right.
And just some very brief examples that we talked about, I think we texted about this, is this letter, right, that AMLO just sent to Biden. Mm-hmm. It starts with that, but basically it was delivered by the foreign minister, by Barcena. Yeah. And in the letter, AMLO says a few things that I think that are worth noting. He talks about how, como usted sabe, nuestras relaciones marchan por muy buen camino. He says like our relationship is going in a really good path.
Yes.
And then he says this, which I think is really interesting. Usted es el primer presidente en décadas que no hace publicidad, construyendo muros en nuestra frontera, ni mucho menos actúa de manera irresponsable e inhumana, como lo hace el gobernador de Texas.
Yes, right. And so, sorry. Anybody who ends up running against Joe Biden in the general election should quote that directly.
It is
You're the first president in generations to build zero wall.
Yeah, and to say like you're not acting in an irresponsible and inhumane manner the way that the governor of Texas is by placing buoys with razor wire in the Rio Grande.
Yes.
So he's saying all of these things, and then at the end he's we're BFFs. He invites Biden to come. And then he weirdly, we talked about how weird this was, but he starts flaunting his projects. He invites Biden to come to Mexico so he can see some of his projects.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Which is so weird. So I wanted to unpack that. And then I also thought it was interesting because in the letter, AMLO is praising Biden, right? He starts by saying, like, Biden has made such great decisions on behalf of his country and of his people. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, in return, it seems like Biden is in return after that trying to appease AMLO, because there was this meeting between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Barcena.
Yes.
And in it, only one Mexican media outlet was allowed to ask questions. Can you guess which one?
Oh, La Jornada.
Of course, it was the only one, which is so interesting because we know this is the one newspaper that's affiliated with the AMLO administration.
It's basically the Pravda of Mexico. It's like the house organ. It's the like the Chinese Global Times.
It's like pro AMLO, pro Cuba, pro Venezuela.
Yeah.
And so these are just two of so many examples of what's happening, but I just thought that would be interesting to insert.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you did. It's I mean, there's just so much that there's so much going on with all of that, and what's interesting is to think about what a turnabout that is from AMLO's previous attitude to President Biden, because he was AMLO was pro-Trump in the beginning. He was one of the few world leaders who would not congratulate Biden on winning the presidency, or I think he was the last major one to do it, because he believes that he's had the presidency stolen from him at least twice himself, but now he's praising Biden to the skies, and thinks that
it's weird.
Can we talk a little bit about the remittances issue too? Because I think did you have that on your list? I didn't mean to.
I know
leapfrog.
I do. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So there's been these recent reports on remittances and how they're related to cartels. And the numbers is Mexico recently registered record remittances of more than 58 billion last year.
Yes.
And that is,
huge.
When you put it up next to other things, that is more than the earnings that it's received from both international tourism and oil revenues. So it's huge, like you say. And so fairly, this has led to a lot of suspicion that these numbers are being boosted by more than just really hardworking Mexicans in the U.S. sending money back to their families.
Yeah.
So this is an investigation that was launched by Reuters, and in it they interview recipients, and the findings show that drug cartels are using remittances, and they're using many legal networks of money transfer services that help migrant workers send money to their families in Mexico, their families back home.
Yeah.
But they're using that for the sales of their drugs in the U.S.
Yeah.
And there's a few different sources that give numbers on this. So one is an anonymous U.S. government official who works on illicit finance, didn't want to be identified, but he said he believes that up to 10% of all Mexico-bound remittances are drug money that's being moved by criminal organizations.
Okay.
And then another estimate comes from Signos Vitales, which is a Mexican think tank.
Sure.
And they say that 7.6, this is much more specific, but 7.6 of all remittances in 2022 for perspective, that's roughly 4.4 billion came from organized crime.
Yeah.
There's a lot more numbers and research that corroborate this, but this is a very interesting report. There's still stuff coming out on it, but it raises a lot of interesting questions.
It does. It's so interesting. You and I have talked about on this show this idea that when somebody is trafficked across the border is not the destination. It's the midpoint of the trafficking journey, and the destination for the trafficking journey is actually the job or whatever point of earning the trafficked person ends up at in the United States, and then that becomes a source of revenue for the trafficking organization later on, because you're either paying off a debt, which you have to put in quotes, or so on. And so there's no question to me but that the remittance system, 58 billion,
it's a lot of money.
So 10%, 5.8 bill, it's not pocket change.
Yeah.
That this is all part of kind of the business model, this very canny business model of the cartels. And so for us on the U.S. side, the question becomes, why do we allow it? The answer, and there is an answer to it, is that we allow it, frankly, out of compassion. That there are a tremendous number of families, and this has been true for generations, that depend upon remittances from Mexico or from the United States back to Mexico or to other places in Latin America for the support of family members. And so that kind of model where you have, what I would describe as sort of the virtuous worker who goes and works in El Norte and sends money back for the upkeep of, wife, kids, and so on, in itself ought to excite our admiration. The problem is that now that every single person is trafficked, thanks in large part to the conscious and deliberate breakdown of the Mexican state, all these individuals are prisoners. And so this tremendous flow of $58 billion, or whatever the true figure is part of what funds politics and criminality within Mexico itself. Very interestingly, we've discussed this on the show before, but it's worth repeating. There is a cult of the migrant now under the Morena regime. This idea that no está, no, what was it? No estás en Mexico, pero Mexico está en tu corazón, right?
Yes,
So you're not in Mexico, but Mexico's in your heart,
right?
Which is cold comfort when it's January in Chicago. But that sentimental, I don't know what you call it, but that sentimental mythos is undergirded by a cold business proposition, because these individuals, who are not all bad people, by the way, you can't, but they are, in aggregate, funding this terrible machine, which is another reason, kind of tying it all together here, that the Mexican state reacts so strongly against anti-illegal immigration measures like the border buoys. Because again, if this all stops and all migration is legal, then that money dries up. And the remittances then suddenly become, in many ways, a clean source of funds that actually do go to the support of families and kids and things like that.
Right.
And that's of course what we would like to see, but it's not what they want to see, and that's why they're fighting us.
Yeah, and maybe that's why AMLO got so angry when he was asked about it. He called routers liars, and he called the think tank that I was telling you about, Signos Vitales.
Yeah.
He said that they were just releasing information to punch him, punch his administration.
Everything for him is if it's
personal.
Contrary to his narrative, it's personal. They're doing it to make me look bad. How can you? And so, which is strangely an effective tactic for him.
If this information, I know I just gave like a couple of percentages, but if that's not compelling enough, I want to.
Please.
I have like 10 things. I know we don't have time for all of that,
fine,
but I want to leave you with some that I found really compelling.
Please.
Some questions that the report raised.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently states like Minnesota, which as you can imagine have very tiny Mexican populations,
yes,
are apparently sending massive remittances to Mexico, which is very unusual. But apparently the remittances from Minnesota to Mexico grew by 585.3% in recent years. I don't know if you had heard that.
585.3%.
585.3% in recent years. And this is according to Signos Vitales.
Okay.
And they are using information from Mexico's central bank. And so this would place Minnesota only right after California and Texas on that list. And Minnesota has a tiny Mexican population.
How interesting.
So just to make you think. And then what's equally curious to me that I read from this report, and there's a lot more where this came from, I wish we had the time, but the destination that the remittances are going to, the remittances that are going to Chiapas are huge, and they're rapidly increasing.
Oh, yeah.
San Cristobal de las Casas received more remittances in last year in 2022 than any other Mexican municipality.
Okay.
And then Comitán de Domínguez, which is, as not a lot of people know, but as we know, transited by all of the migrants that are being smuggled across the border from nearby Guatemala.
Comitán de los Domínguez? Is that in Chiapas?
Yes, that's in Chiapas.
So
too.
I like the people you're referencing, I did not know that. So sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sorry,
well, it's basically what people that are coming from Guatemala.
You cross at Tapachula. Tapachula is like usually the crossing point from Guatemala, and then sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
But so Comitán de Domínguez is where the migrants that have been smuggled across the border from Guatemala, which we know right now is sending the most migrants to Mexico. They have to transit through that portion.
I did not know that. Okay.
And
right,
so
please.
they ranked top 10 as well of municipalities where remittances are being sent to.
That's interesting. So they're going back to if I understand what you're implying here, because that's kind of mind blowing to me. When you tell me that Chiapas is a big destination for remittances, that doesn't automatically raise a flag for me, because Chiapas is it's pastoral and it's a sending point. So I get that. But if you're telling me that a place like Comitán de los Domínguez, is that what it's called?
Comitán de Domínguez.
Comitán de Domínguez. Okay,
yeah.
So Comitán de Domínguez, which itself is a transit point. It's not a sending point. It's a transit point for people coming elsewhere, but it's getting the remittances.
Right, and they don't usually have like very high levels of migration. So
from
that makes
place.
It makes it unusual.
So there's somebody organized there that's receiving these funds, and it's
yeah.
gotta be.
And another question, since we're talking about that specific
That's
place.
interesting.
Yeah, in all of these 227 municipalities, all of the households on average received more than one remittance monthly, which is interesting. And the other question that I thought was interesting was, why, if the amounts of income from remittances are analyzed in many of these municipalities, why is extreme poverty, such as in Chiapas, still due to income still rampant despite these additional incomes? So it's not, if they're tracking the remittances in these municipalities, why is everyone still so poor? Mm-hmm. If the remittances that they're receiving would take 100% of the population above the poverty line.
Yeah. Something else is happening to it.
Yeah.
There's an organization that's either skimming or simply redirecting.
Yeah. This is very interesting. I will also link the report. I found it fascinating. But I think there's new stuff coming out on it daily. So there should be more updates by the time we film the next episode, hopefully.
It's a lot of big stuff going on, and it really feels like the coming 18 months is going to be an inflection point in this entire saga. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time. We did promise our listeners that we would say a little bit about all the violence that's been happening in Mexico. For some reason, and I know this is constant. I know like there's one disappearance every hour under AMLO, but for some reason, I feel like in the last week, I have been getting like more people sending me these like horrific articles about things happening in Mexico. I don't know if you feel that way, or maybe in the last 2 weeks.
Did we talk? We didn't talk about the 5.
No, we didn't get to it last week. So I want to talk about the violence in Mexico. And before I do that, I want to go back to what I started the episode with.
Los levantados.
Levantones. And so I kind of... I started with a story and I kind of left you hanging, which I'm sure you expected because that's how a lot of cases go in Mexico. Yeah. You have a disappearance and then you never hear anything back. But in this case, there's more to the story.
Please.
So I started off with a story about Sandra Luz Hernandez and the forced disappearance of Edgar, her son. Mm-hmm. So Sandra became like a big activist in Mexico. I hadn't heard of her before, but she became like a huge activist. She kind of became like the voice of all the family members that had lost.
I know the end of the story.
You know the story.
No. Please continue for our listeners.
Destroyed me.
This is so sad. Go ahead.
So she became like the voice of these family members, and she would organize like local searches with like bloodhounds and all of these things for the missing people in Mexico.
Yes.
And she said she like became a rock in the shoe of the authorities, or like a thorn in their side. But one day after she was meeting with the authorities, she got this phone call from someone saying that they had information on the whereabouts of her son, Edgar. And so she obviously was like, she wanted to know. So they gave her an address to go to. She went to that address, and as she was arriving, a car pulled up, someone jumped out, and they shot her 15 times.
That's right.
So horrible story. I'm sure like I hadn't heard it before, but you've heard it before. Yeah. But I just thought that this was like a very devastating story that tells, the story about one more victim of the drug war that we don't often hear about. It's the people that are seeking out the truth, the activists that are seeking out the truth.
She if I remember correctly, and if I'm not confusing her with another mother, because there are a few mothers out there who have kind of dedicated
lots of stories like this.
There's lots of stories like it.
Yeah.
I think this was her. She had said, because somebody asked her about the risk of getting killed, because she was making enemies. The police don't want to be pushed on this. The authorities don't want to be pushed on this. The criminals, although in some cases I repeat myself, because often it is the police and the authorities who do these things.
Yeah.
She was asked about the risk that she would be killed, and she had said they already killed her when they took her son.
Oh,
yeah.
That's so sad.
Yeah.
I heard a similar story, but it was the lady that was looking for her daughter that also got killed, like in plain sight. So there's a lot. There's a Netflix documentary about this one.
Yeah.
But so I wanted to use that story to talk a little bit more about the news stories that we got, and asked you about the response of the Mexican government to some of these stories. So obviously we know like it's not equal around the state. Like it's concentrated in certain areas, but the numbers of the disappearances and murders in Mexico are like incredibly shocking once you look into them. But some of the horrific news stories that we've talked about, that we've recently seen, apparently this Friday there was 7 bodies recovered, which appeared to belong to 13 missing migrants. So apparently this just came out, but the murders happened over a dispute over control of human trafficking routes between the Sinaloa and the Juarez cartel.
Okay.
And so these migrants failed to pay the derecho de piso money, which is like the right of passage money.
Yes.
And so they were killed. It cost them their lives. The second story, which David sent us, our journalist in Mexico City, is about how frozen, hacked up bodies of 13 people were found in ice chests and freezers in Veracruz.
Jeez.
Which seems to be a sign that the massacre of migrants is coming back to Mexico. But the reaction of that local Morena governor was that basically he just said, like, he tried to downplay it. And what AMLO said about it is like, no, ya no hay masacres, is what he said. And then the third story, I think you sent me.
No. They're not massacres.
There's no more.
There's no more massacres.
Yeah.
No.
Since his
okay.
Since his hugs and bullets,
right.
Very successful strategy.
Yeah.
And then you sent me this story, but last week there were 5 friends from Lagos de Morena.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I don't even want to like go in. I'll link it.
We should talk about this briefly though. Do you mind?
Yes.
You want me to do it, or do you want?
Go ahead.
You don't. Okay. I mean, it's disgusting. It's disgusting even in the context of Mexican violence, but essentially there's these 5 buddies who are going out, and they're
like a fair.
They're young. They're like 18, 19. I mean, they're not even that old.
Yeah.
And a lot of the cartels use forced recruiting. Basically, they'll kidnap somebody and then they'll brutalize them and things like that. And we've known for years and years that if you read about kind of the cruelty and just these disgusting and abhorrent methods used by like the Wagner Group in Russia, where one of the things that they do is they part of your training is you have to kill one of your classmates or something like that. Like it's just awful. Well, the cartels do that too. It's a method of dehumanization. Once you do it, you're complicit. You've had that bit of your soul kind of like stolen basically and stripped away. And so it happens over and over. The theory is that these 5 buddies were kidnapped, and it was an intent to forcibly recruit them for the Jalisco cartel. I think.
They were told they would get a job.
They were told they would get a job. They were going to take it whether they wanted to or not. And it has become a notorious case because there is a film that got posted on social media. I would encourage anybody listening to not look for this, actually.
Yeah.
So we're not going to link to it.
No.
But it's out there. And they forced these 5 boys who were good friends to kill each other, bludgeon one another to death, and it's even in a Mexican context, that still retains a capacity to shock. And what's especially disgusting about it is that the president of Mexico himself was asked about it at his mañanera, and he pretended he couldn't hear the question, and then he mocked it. Afterwards.
He made a joke.
He made a joke about it. It's a joke. It's a joke to this guy, but we know whose side he's on.
And it's not funny. There's 110,000, missing people right now in Mexico. There's people being killed. This video, I haven't watched it, obviously. I don't want to.
Don't.
But it's horrific. And then they found the bodies. They were all killed in horrific ways. They were decapitated. I'm not even going to talk about it.
Yeah.
But their parents had to identify them. Yeah. And so obviously, like, people were horrified by this. Not that it doesn't happen often, but they kept shouting questions at him. And for him to make, like, a very distasteful, very cruel joke.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's just so disrespectful to the families. And it just, it's interesting because it brings us back to something that we've talked about a lot. Yeah. He's never condemned these actions by cartels. Still.
No.
But he refuses to meet with, like, the mothers of people, the family members of people that have been murdered, people that have gone missing. It's clear what side he's on.
I think this is actually a good this is a good note probably to wrap up the episode on.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to understand, all of our policy advocacy and analysis, 100% of it is done 100% from the perspective of what's best for Texas and what's best for the United States. There's no question in my mind that we have a preferential option for American citizens in all things, and that's as it should be because our bonds of allegiance and citizenship compel us to that. But I do want to note, when you ask yourself, especially for our friends on the left, the ones who will spread false stories about Border Patrolmen, whipping migrants, about Texas National Guardsmen shooting guys doing sports on the south side of the river, who actually cares about about the people of Mexico, who actually sees them as bearers of the image of God, who actually sees them as individuals who deserve to live lives of dignity and free of the terrorization that reigns across that country. It's us. It's us who are raising questions about use of armed force, who are talking about the necessity of shutting down trafficking, who are advocating for control and even closure of the border. And we cannot forget that. We're the ones who actually care about, candidly, about the Mexicans. And for you and I in particular, it's because of personal interest. You're from South America. I'm ethnically half Mexican. But I would include all of our colleagues, in this movement with us, in that moral estimation. And we have to remind people over and over that we do have that moral high ground on this. So thanks for...
Well, I think that's a wrap with that. Thank you,
Melissa.
Josh. It's good to be back in the studio with you. And
good to have you back.
Thank you to all of our listeners. We'll see you next time.